When we think of long-term psychiatric institutions, we usually picture them as places of healing. But what if that system is fundamentally flawed? In this explainer, we're going to dive into a really powerful critique of institutional mental health care, one that's going to ask us to see the whole thing with fresh eyes.
So, everything we're talking about today is based on a challenging book with a pretty radical idea that the very model of locking people away for long periods of time, even though it's designed to help, can actually get in the way of real recovery.
And this really gets to the heart of the matter. It's a huge paradox, right? How can a place that's built for safety and treatment also become a source of fear, dependency, and even social isolation? Okay, before we go any further, let's get one thing straight. This critique is not about the entire field of psychiatry or all the incredibly dedicated clinicians working in it. No, it's focused on a very specific and often hidden logic of care that puts control way ahead of healing. So we're not talking about brief hospital stays that can be absolutely necessary or about skilled therapy. What we are zeroing in on is this long-term custodial model where watching people and controlling them become the main tools. A system that basically confuses just containing people with actually helping them heal. To really get why this institutional model is so persistent, we actually have to look outside its walls. See, the journey to a psychiatric ward often starts long before anyone sees a crisis. It begins with all the systemic pressures of just trying to get by in everyday life. And this image is a great way to picture it. It's this idea of a funnel. It shows how all these different social and structural problems, things like poverty, not having a stable place to live, not getting the right services, all pile up, pushing people toward a breaking point where the institution feels like the only option left. And when you break down that funnel, it's wow. You can see it so clearly. The chronic stress from just being poor, the instability of not having a home, dealing with discrimination, being isolated, it all just compounds. And when the community services that are supposed to help are too broken to step in early, a full-blown crisis becomes almost inevitable. And here's where it gets really sobering. The research found that for some people, being involuntarily hospitalized was actually linked to an increase in bad outcomes, like getting arrested or even suicide. So the very thing that was supposed to prevent a crisis might actually be making it deeper. All right, so what happens once someone is inside those walls? This is where you see that super fine line between providing care and just imposing control. The book calls this the coercion continuum. On paper, the promise of institutional care is pretty clear, right? It's about healing, giving support, and helping someone get their personal agency back. But the reality, according to this analysis, can be a whole different story. An environment that pretty much demands submission and fosters fear and a kind of strategic silence just to get by. And this brings us to a really crucial idea: informal coercion. Now, this isn't about physical restraints or legal orders. We're talking about the subtle, everyday pressures. The veiled threats, the manipulation, using privileges as leverage that make sure a patient does what they're told, often without leaving any kind of paper trail. I mean, think about it. When a clinician says you really need to cooperate if you want to go home soon, is that helpful advice or is it a threat? When your actual freedom is on the line, that distinction gets real blurry real fast. Even a simple conversation can feel loaded with pressure. So what do people do in that situation? Well, they adapt. They learn to play ball. They learn to say what the staff wants to hear. They literally perform being compliant just so they can get out faster. And tragically, a lot of them learn to hide their most dangerous thoughts because they're afraid that being honest will just mean being locked up for longer. And get this kind of adaptation isn't just a psychological trick. The book argues it actually has a biological basis. An environment where you're constantly under threat fundamentally changes how your brain works, making the whole process of therapy incredibly difficult. So you have to wonder, right? What is all that constant pressure, being watched, being judged, being at risk of losing your freedom? What does that actually do to a person's brain? Well, the answer, to put it simply, is that the brain shifts gears. It moves out of a state of reflection and learning and straight into survival mode. When you feel trapped or unsafe, your brain just prioritizes staying alert and protecting yourself over the complex, deep thinking that therapy absolutely requires. Let's break that down real quick. First, the brain detects a constant threat. Second, it flips on the survival systems, which makes you hyper-aware and reliant on old habits. And third, because of that, the higher-level brain functions you need for self-reflection and flexible thinking, they get impaired. And this quote just brings all that neuroscience back down to the human cost. If the environment you're in teaches you that telling the truth is dangerous, then the very foundation of treatment starts to fall apart. Not just psychologically, but biologically. The source has a term for this, and it's absolutely chilling: weaponized disclosure. It's this devastating outcome where a patient learns that if they're vulnerable, if they're honest about their fear or suicidal thoughts, it won't be met with support. Instead, it'll be used as a weapon against them, a reason to ramp up control and punishment. Okay, so what's the real bottom line here? What is the ultimate price of a system that relies so heavily on confinement? We've seen the human cost, but the financial and societal costs, they are just staggering. A huge part of this story is just following the money. A massive amount of cash gets poured into the institutional machine, paying for beds, for security, for readmission after readmission, while all the proactive community supports that could actually prevent a crisis in the first place are constantly starved for funding. And if you want a number, hold on to your hats. One state-level analysis estimated the annual societal cost of untreated mental illness at a whopping $4.2 billion. But what's really shocking is where most of that cost is coming from. It's not the hospital bills. The direct costs are just a tiny fraction of the total. The vast majority of it? It's all indirect costs: lost productivity from unemployment, the massive burden of housing instability, and the huge expense of the justice system getting involved when people fall through the cracks. Confinement isn't just expensive. Its failures create ripples across our entire society. Which leaves us with the ultimate question posed by our source material. In light of all this, the social funnel, the coercive environment, the impact on the brain, and the staggering costs, we really have to ask ourselves, what kind of treatment truly deserves to be called help?